The post-war history of the Philippines has been a balance between having successfully achieved independence and subsequent struggle with internal conflict. Liberated from Japanese occupation by the United States in the summer of 1945, the Republic of the Philippines was born on the 4th of July, 1946. The first decades of the new state were a mixture of economic and social reform and introduction of the Philippines onto the world stage. The growing pains of the new republic were felt even before independence. Philippine President Manuel Quezon died in 1944, still running his government in exile from the US. He was succeeded by his vice president, Sergio Osmeña. Osmeña was not very well known by his countrymen, and his political party had fallen out of favor during the Japanese occupation. The first set of presidential elections for the new republic was held in April 1946, before they were officially independent, so there would be no lame duck period should the presidency change hands. Osmeña's opponent was Manuel Roxas, a populist who was vocally supported by General Douglas MacArthur. Roxas sought to rebuild his nation from not only the bitter years of the Japanese occupation, but he also wanted to mend the nearly 4 centuries of foreign domination his people had endured. This video is brought to you by War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, engulfing over 2,500 planes, tanks, ships, and helicopters of 10 major nations. You can use all of these in epic PvP battles. Each model is very detailed, and the whole collection spans over 100 years, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. You can apply hundreds of camouflages, 3D decorations, or historical markings, such as bushes or equipment on your machine. What I truly like besides the details is how War Thunder creates a realistic and immersive battlefield, with realistic graphics and authentic sound effects, creating the perfect balance of strategy and entertainment. With shots you land on enemy players, you'll get to watch an X-ray view, showing the damage of your shells wrecked on the interiors of enemy vehicles. Use my link in the description to download, register, and play War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. New and returning players who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of a premium account. It's available for a limited time only, so do not miss it. Roxas wanted to bring the Philippines into the United Nations and open the archipelago to the world. He also understood that, like so many countries around the globe after the Second World War, the rebuilding of his country relied on massive loans from the United States. His administration ensured those funds by signing 99-year lease agreements with the Americans on major military bases that had already been established. These loans also tied the Philippine and American economies tightly together. Roxas's presidency was cut short on the 15th of April 1948, when he suffered a fatal heart attack while giving a speech at Clark Air Base. His vice president, Elpidio Quirino, immediately succeeded to the presidency. Quirino oversaw many of the social reforms his predecessor had pledged to implement. This included health insurance, an old age pension system, unemployment insurance, state relief, and open labor opportunities that had not previously existed. Quirino also created agencies to help offer aid and loans to Filipinos who had been previously cut out of economic assistance. The next election was set for the year after he took office, at which point he ran for a full term of his own. His opponent was Jose Laurel, who had been president under the Japanese occupation and was considered by many to be a collaborator. The election was seen as corrupt at the time, and is considered so by many historians. But there is disagreement as to whether this truly affected the outcome, as Laurel did not take any major steps to dispute it. Quirino's presidency also saw the emergence of a communist party that opposed him and his government, openly calling for its overthrow. By the 1953 election, the US was supporting his opponent, Ramon Magsaysay, who won easily. The administration of Ramon Magsaysay has been held up as an example of honest and non-corrupt governing, to the point that his single term in office has been called the Golden Years by many Filipinos. Magsaysay championed his people on the world stage, reinforcing the concept of the Philippines as a bulwark against the spread of communism both at home and abroad. In 1954, he led the foundation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, also known as the Manila Pact, which proclaimed the Philippines as an international partner in the fight against communism. Magsaysay sent members of the Philippine Army to help United Nations forces protect South Korea. He also briefly forced communist groups at home to go into exile and cease their political agitation. Magsaysay did not have the opportunity to complete the reforms he designed. He was killed in a plane crash on the 17th of March, 1957. Vice President Carlos P. Garcia succeeded him, and then served a full term of his own. Garcia was succeeded by his vice president, Diosdado Macapagal, after losing to him in the 1961 elections. Macapagal's administration is best known for enacting land reforms around the tenancy of farmers, and for changing the date on which Philippine independence is celebrated, from the 4th of July to the 12th of June, changing the recognition away from the end of the occupation by the U.S. to the end of Spanish colonial period in 1898. He lost the 1965 election to Ferdinand Marcos, the best-known modern leader of the Philippines, and not for positive reasons. Ferdinand Marcos held control over the Philippines between 1965 and 1986. Marcos began as a president elected on promises of economic and social reforms, and ended in a dictatorship. A military attempt to bring part of Borneo under Philippine rule prompted a massacre of Muslims in southern parts of the archipelago, a terrible occasion that was made worse by the Marcos administration's suppression of journalism around the events. Despite this, he was incredibly popular and won a second term in 1969. His second term saw a great deal of unrest, beginning with massive financial problems directly related to his unrestrained spending during his campaign. Demonstrations that turned violent, rumors of a planned coup d'etat, and an attack during a campaign rally allowed Marcos to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and enact martial law in 1972. His political opponents were forbidden from expressing themselves, even in a peaceful manner. They were either arrested or sent into exile, generally without any sort of actual trial to prove their guilt. Martial law would remain in effect until 1981. This second term coincided with a constitutional convention planned for 1970, during which revisions would be made to the 1935 Constitution. Marcos used this to his advantage, arranging changes to the government that allowed him to remain in power after the provisions of the earlier constitution would have required that he step down. He changed the actual nature of the government by shifting it from a presidential system to a parliamentary one. People no longer directly voted for a president. The party with the largest number of seats in Congress nominated their candidate. By 1973, the new constitution was in place, and no one could effectively oust Marcos. His new administration was composed of nepotists who enacted his policies while enriching themselves. Marcos also assured the support of the military with a steady supply of money. Marcos claimed that he needed to enact these policies to ensure that the new society he was creating would thrive. He vowed to eliminate corruption, ease economic strain on his fellow citizens, and make the Philippines a stronger international player. Despite this, the Philippine economy shrunk steadily as trade relations dwindled, causing millions to go hungry and not a small number of deaths. In the face of these elements, it is hardly surprising that the Marcos administration relied on blunt force to stay in power. Those deemed a threat to the regime were arrested and held without trial, and only released if they were scared into submission. Martial law was officially lifted in January 1981, but Marcos retained all of the power he'd held during that time. Elections held in June of that year put Marcos into another 6-year term, but pressure from increasing opposition outside the Philippines, especially from the United States, combined with shock over the poorly covered-up assassination of Marcos's primary opposition, Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., forced a snap election on the 7th of February, 1986. Marcos was up against Corazon Aquino, the wife of the assassinated leader. Each side declared their candidate the winner, though it is evident that Aquino actually did get more votes. The dispute prompted weeks of civil unrest and an attempted coup, culminating in 2 inaugurations, Marcos at his palace and Aquino at a social club. Shortly after his ceremony, however, Marcos and his family were evacuated from the capital in a U.S. Army helicopter, eventually ending up in Hawaii, where Ferdinand Marcos would die 3 years later. Imelda eventually returned to the Philippines and still lives there as of this writing. Corazon Aquino was elected as the next president of the Philippines and immediately formed a revolutionary government to normalize the situation left by Marcos and provided for a transitional freedom constitution. This new constitution effectively crippled the powers of the president. They could no longer unilaterally declare martial law, proposed the creation of autonomous regions in the Cordilleras and Muslim Mindanao to stabilize the Philippine Islands and hopefully prevent civil war, and restored the presidential form of government and the bicameral Congress. She also did not renew treaties that would have allowed the United States to maintain control over various military bases that they'd held since the Second World War. Unfortunately, Aquino's administration was plagued by infighting, as well as a devastating natural disaster. Different groups sought varied agendas, and this slowed economic and social reform to a crawl. Her work toward fixing the economy after the kleptocratic Marcos regime was somewhat undone by the eruption of Mount Pinatubo on the 2nd of April 1991, when the volcano started erupting. A tremendous explosion on the 12th of July 1991 buried Clark Air Base, rendering it unusable for recovery. A staggering $100 million in damage. At least 840 deaths were reported, and over 200,000 were left homeless. Aquino was succeeded by Fidel Ramos, who negotiated with various armed opposition groups and managed to bring many of them to a peaceful reconciliation. However, his successor, Joseph Estrada, conducted military operations to put down one of these insurgent groups, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Estrada did not finish his term in office, but resigned after being impeached over bribes from illegal gambling operations. The two most recent presidents of the nation have been controversial. Rodrigo Duterte began his presidency in 2016 with a platform of increased infrastructure spending, tax reform, increased enforcement of anti-drug laws, and other general improvements. He was and is generally approved of by the people of the Philippines, but his methods, which included briefly implementing martial law and outright executions of criminals, are widely questioned. This and his attempts to reorient Philippine policy away from the US and toward China and Russia caused pushback from much of the rest of the world. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., better known as Bongbong, came to power in 2022. His administration has been marked as well as attempts to shift away from some of the more criticized of Duterte's programs. The first decades of the 21st century have been a time of international unease for the Philippines, as the Republic sought to either reinforce old alliances or establish new foreign ties. In the early 2000s, the Chinese government sought to form closer economic and political ties, but these failed to materialize, in part because China has steadily pushed for territorial expansion and ownership of all regions and resources in the South China Sea. The rich fishing grounds, newly discovered underwater deposits of oil, and command of the waterways around Taiwan make this region an important part of the Chinese government's future goals. No matter what the future holds, the Philippines will be an important part of politics in the Pacific and the rest of the world. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to click our link in the description to play the game for free on PC, Xbox, or PlayStation now by using my link in the description, and pinned in the comments below, and get these awesome rewards.